We're ready to take questions from our colleagues in this honorable institution, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, distinguished sponsor, were there any savings in the President's Contingent Fund in 2021?
Mr. Speaker, as I was informed that there was no savings in the 2021 Contingent Fund of the Office of the President.
Were there any savings in the President's Contingent Fund in 2022? Or similarly, there were no savings?
Mr. Speaker, in 2022, the Office of the President has a savings, according to the information that I got.
And how much was the amount of the savings in 2022?
Mr. Speaker, we will get back to the honorable lawmaker from Bicol regarding that matter, as our team are computing right now the exact figure on how much savings does the Office of the President has in 2022, Mr. Speaker.
And when was the savings declared by the Office of the President in 2022?
Mr. Speaker, I was just informed that it is continuing and it hasn't been declared yet, but the savings is around 53 million pesos, Mr. Speaker.
53 million.
Correct, Mr. Speaker.
Sometime in December 2022, the Office of the Vice President requested from the Office of the President the amount of 150 million for its contingent funds. Is that correct?
Mr. Speaker, there was indeed a request, but the request was 250 million pesos, Mr. Speaker.
And how much was approved?
Only 125 million was granted, Mr. Speaker, and this was covered by rules or regulations covered by the release of the Office of the President, this budget, Mr. Speaker.
Does the distinguished sponsor have a copy of the request of the Vice President?
Mr. Speaker, we will furnish our colleague from the Bicol region a copy within the day, Mr. Speaker.
Can we request that that letter be emailed to the Office of the Majority Leader before we terminate the deliberation and approval of the budget proposed for 2024 for the Office of the President?
Mr. Speaker, we will do so. We will comply, but I believe the copy is with the Department of Budget and Management. That definitely, after this, we will immediately inform the Office of the Department of Budget and Management, Mr. Speaker.
Are we being told that the letter of the Vice President was addressed not to the Office of the President, but to the Department of Budget and Management?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the letter was addressed to the Department of Budget and Management, and the request was received by the DBM, Mr. Speaker.
But the Office of the President has a copy of that letter.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Office of the President has a copy of the letter.
Who among the officials present of the Office of the President has read that letter?
I believe, Mr. Speaker, the letter was given to the President. The President saw that letter and it was passed on to the Department of Budget and Management, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Now, that amount of 125 million was from the savings of the Office of the President, more particularly the savings of the Contingent Fund. Is that correct?
No, it isn't, Mr. Speaker. The budget is not part of the savings of the Office of the President, Mr. Speaker.
Uh-huh. So where did this amount come from?
The amount, Mr. Speaker, came from the Contingent Fund, which is classified into capital outlay, MOOEs. It is lodged with the Bureau of Treasury, and the participation of the Office of the President is only the approval of the release of 125 billion pesos to the Office of the Vice President, Mr. Speaker.
So it came from the Contingent Fund of the President, which were not yet disbursed, and not from the savings of the Contingent Fund. Is that correct?
It is a special purpose fund, Mr. Speaker, of the Office of the President,
No, we're not talking.
and not part of the savings, Mr. Speaker.
You are telling us, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, that the 125 million did not come from savings in the Contingent Fund, and it came from the undisbursed or unallocated Contingent Fund of the President in 2022. Is that clear?
It is a contingent fund, Mr. Speaker, but for special, it is classified under special purpose fund, Mr. Speaker, by dear colleague from the Bicol region.
From the what? May I know?
Special purpose fund. It is a contingent fund under the special purpose fund, Mr. Speaker.
Was that amount of 120 million an augmentation?
Mr. Speaker, an item in the GAA, but not savings or nor it is an augmentation fund, Mr. Speaker.
No. Was the release in the nature of an augmentation in the office of the Vice President?
Definitely not, Mr. Speaker. It is not an augmentation.
So what, quote unquote, is an animal is this? It is not savings, it is that augmentation.
The contingent fund, Mr. Speaker, is a special purpose fund for new or urgent projects or activities, Mr. Speaker.
Well,
But it is, may I add, my colleague, that it is in the line item, Mr. Speaker, in the GAA.
when a release is made to another office, this is to cover deficiencies in the appropriated items in the recipient office. Is that correct?
It can, Mr. Speaker, but it can also cover specific projects or new projects.
What new projects were covered by this 125 million release?
I believe this was used by the OVP under Special Purposes Project, Mr. Speaker, and this question should be addressed to the Office of the Vice President, Mr. Speaker.
So the Office of the President did not anymore monitor to what expenditure items the 125 million was utilized by the Office of the Vice President.
The request actually, Mr. Speaker, was good governance and social services as according to the request made to the Office of the President, Mr. Speaker.
And it is important that we have a copy of that request.
Definitely, Mr. Speaker, we will do that within the day.
But within the day, at that time, the budget of for the Office of the President must have been approved already. So we were requesting that before the approval. Anyway, it's so easy to email a copy to the Office of the Majority Leader, so that the best document is the letter.
What I heard, Mr. Speaker, my dear friend from the Bicol region, Region 5, an email or a text is already sent to the Office of the Department of Budget and Management a few minutes ago, sir.
Okay. Let me just inform this body that augmentation of any item of appropriation should come from savings. And only appropriated amounts wherein there is a deficiency can be augmented. That is pursuant to the general provisions of the General Appropriations Act for 2022. Would the distinguished sponsor confirm that?
Noted, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, if I may add, my distinguished colleague, I agree it is not an augmentation, but it is an appropriated amount in the GAA of 2023, Mr. Speaker.
And
as a special purpose fund.
And what was that appropriated amount?
I believe it's a total of 7 billion, Mr. Speaker.
The 7 billion is the contingent fund. Is that correct?
7 billion in 2022 and 13 billion in 2023, Mr. Speaker.
Those were amounts for the contingent fund of the
Yes,
President.
Mr. Speaker.
Let me also inform this August body that the Office of the Vice President had no confidential funds appropriated in 2022. The item reading or denominated as confidential, intelligence, and extraordinary expenses had a zero appropriation. With a zero appropriation, the intention of the Congress in the 2022 GAA was not to fund this item of expenditure. Is this correct?
Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Lagman is correct, but this is under the contingent fund, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, we are talking about the contingent fund because the amount of 125,000 came from the contingent fund. And it is also correct that a zero appropriation, if we call it appropriation, cannot be augmented.
Can you run that question one more time, Congressman Honorable
When
Lagman?
an item of expenditure has no appropriation or zero, it cannot be augmented under the general provisions of the GAA for 2022.
Mr. Speaker, the contingent fund is a special purpose fund for new or urgent projects or activities. So the request of the Office of the Vice President came up after the GAA was approved, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, the Office of the President has to release funds because it was requested by the Office of the Vice President, Mr. Speaker.
Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the distinguished sponsor does not answer my question. With that statement, Mr. Speaker, I would end my interpellation on the proposed budget of the Office of the President, and I would not ask any more questions because my questions are not properly answered or squarely answered by the distinguished sponsor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, distinguished sponsor.